You know that like occultism brain rot has reached a terminal stage when you can't even look like at a meme on Instagram or wherever without making it somewhat occult.
Yeah, yeah.
Like like for me right now, it's like like the ooh ee ah cat. Let me
Mhm.
in post, let me insert the fucking noise that I'm referring to here. Like it's to me that's just a PGM phylactery.
Right, right.
That's just Greek vowels, baby.
It's
Exactly. Like,
it's an apotropaic cat if I've ever seen one.
It's absolutely words
mhm.
away the evil in my life.
And like the occult brain rot's really taking over. Like, for those who know, you must never eat foods that contain red oil.
Oh my God, yeah. And you're like Tem Dende.
Oh, dun, dun, dun. Be not alarmed at the frightful howls which you may hear. It is Svinga,
Hey,
Salt,
Yo,
and Barrett, the way I'm stealing people's talismans key.
no, not good old the Magus,
Yeah,
not
exactly.
aka the plagiarist. Very
Precisely
common
the
for
one.
grimoires, though. They're all largely plagiarizing each other. But Barrett's just got it.
Yeah, exactly. The British Museum ain't got nothing on Barrett, right?
British Museum ain't got nothing on me, Key.
Mhm.
The way I'm stealing all these talismans.
Yeah, the way I'm plundering artifacts.
No, no. No, you're just doing Cyprianic treasure hunting. It's okay.
It's true.
Yeah.
The way I'm advocating for, but also resisting repatriation. Who knows?
Oh my God, yeah. Oh my God. I mean, listen, that treasure hunting magic, it do be a specialty of yours, I know.
Really is, yeah.
Mm.
But one of the other specialties of mine is smooth transitions, which I will remind everyone that we can, just as Barrett likes to plagiarize talismans, we don't like to be plagiarized. So you can check us out directly on patreon.com/the Grateful Owls. We have a bonus episode every month curated by and just for our patrons, a Discord server that has been popping off. We have scrying as a group, we have magical experiments, we have magical homework. Come check it out, it's a good time. We also have Salt's Fantastic Almanac, a monthly live occult book club where we discuss a text of your choosing. We also have show notes for every episode and a whole tier for monthly group spell work from the three of us on your behalf.
And it's been going great. Our first one was on the equinox. It was elected by Assault's Almanac, and it was for prosperity and a fortune.
That it was. Be sure to check that out next time if you're interested, and if not, any amount of interaction or engagement helps. As such, remember to give us a like, a rating, and review on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you might be listening to us. It helps us fight the demiurge of the algorithm, which is currently contained in the British Museum.
Fucking real. It's like John D is calling. Do you accept? Yes or yes?
Hitting that yes button, being like, give me that Abrasax chicken nugget, with fucking
Yeah.
whatever it is. Whatever fried fucking rooster heads on serpent Aeon bodies we got.
Saw and I have already debated this about whether or not you should make basilisks. We've been through it.
Oh man. And if you want to pay us to make a basilisk for you against our better judgment, because I love a smooth transition. Uh, be sure to check out our services. I offer personalized coaching in magic and mediumship, sorcery for hire, readings, and custom talismans, oils, and tools. Although I would not dare make a basilisk glizzy lest it tempts Sfinga. Who offers Balkan Favamancy readings. She's the best. Go book a session with her right now.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
and yeah, no problem. You are indeed the best. So happy to advocate.
Oh.
And Salt's books are closed in the astrological realm, but be sure to keep an eye out for his monthly almanac on the Patreon. It is worth its weight in gold and probably metals yet unknown to science that are even more precious than that. Lastly, be sure to hit us up on social media. Sfinga is at Dragon Cunning. Salt is at Salt C and C. That's letters CANDC. And I am barnowl.key.
Hell yeah, brother.
Boom.
Boom, 5 booms.
Five booms for a smooth transition.
Why? Okay, if the three of us were the Costco guys. Who's AJ? Who's Big Justice? Uh, who's their homunculus? What's the name of the third guy? The Rizzler. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, the Rizzler.
yeah.
I'm so out of the loop here. What's the Costco
Yeah.
guys?
You know what? As soon as we finish this episode, Key and I are gonna sit you down so you can learn.
Mhm.
Okay, I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, perfect. But
No.
speaking of learning, I love that we're gonna talk about talismans, amulets, charms, fetishes, phylacteries. There's a lot of synonyms out there. And there's a lot of debate as to what these categories exactly mean and how they're separate from each other. Not just among magicians, but among scholars.
Mhm.
So, Salt, this episode was your idea. And I remember when you were talking about it initially, you were saying that the purpose is not to necessarily delve into like the nitty-gritty of like scholarship. It's to talk about on a practical level what these are and how they serve us. And so I'm really excited to dive into it with you. We are going to touch on some scholarship, but I do think it's good to note that any anyone that is advocating for like a very narrow definition is going to immediately encounter a bunch of situations in which the term cannot necessarily apply.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things, even in the English language world, it's a nightmare to define. And then you come into the problem of translation, right? Like, for example, in China, we have food talismans, and that means something very, very particular, it means something quite specific, right?
Hmm.
Um, but the translation for that is talisman. So the I think this is one of those topics, one of those concepts that the best way to consider what a talisman is really, rather than necessarily, I mean, I think it's important to define it, and I think we're going to try and, look at some definitions of it, but the best approach to understanding them as a whole is really to consider the functions, the use, the construction of these things, that we call talismans, to understand their practical applications. Because as a concept, talismans is, it's a little bit of a floating point, I'd argue, in so much as like the word is used mostly in accordance with whatever the speaker is saying at that time. We find a kind of similar example when we talk about spirit in early modern medical texts, even where it's especially animal spirits that they're, a floating point. They do mean something specific, but that meaning can change. It can adapt over time depending on the context of the speaker, where they're coming from, where their understanding lies. And talismans are probably an even more apt example of that. Um, and obviously, the result of that is, as with defining magic, it's a fucking headache.
I know, and we've touched
But
on like why is it's hard to define magic, and why that's like a hotly contested category that has it's very loaded too. It carries a lot of different like we might see magic as a positive thing when we talk about this. And for a discussion of this problem, check out one of our earlier episodes that was in Super Incantation Bowl where we actually talk about like Babylonian and Jewish Aramaic demon bowls, incantation bowls, and we talk about actually why some scholars resist referring to these as magical technologies, because even though we would consider them magical and we see magic as a positive thing, like we're very happy to say, of course it's magical. Like, I mean, transubstantiation is magical, the ritual of the Eucharist is magical, these kinds of things. It's because these are often deployed as anti-magic technologies. And so even a lot of amulets that we can talk about that we would inherently see as magical are not seen that way. Like an azar, for example, which we'll talk about later, is not seen as by a lot of people as magical. It's seen as anti-magical because it wards away magic, which is associated with pernicious or illicit forms of ritual power.
No, exactly, spot on. Like it just is such a it's such a context dependent subject matter when we come to defining these various concepts. And in this capacities, talismans are just as hard to kind of nail down and characterize in any particular quality and way. Like even best definitions of them have to allow for that flexibility in use of the term, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think what a good place to start, because we might want to ask, like, is there a difference? Because even if you Google, like, what's the difference in a talisman and an amulet, you will get an answer. And the answer seems pretty consistent in terms of, like, defining them. And generally people say, and like, is a talisman has a very specific intention or goal that has to do with creating or manifesting specific outcomes, like, for example, bringing fortune. It tends to empower the person who is wearing it. For example, it fulfills a particular role in this way, whereas an amulet specifically wards off evil or negative energy or bad spirits and so on and so forth, right?
Mhm.
And it acts as a kind of shield. Now, obviously, this can vary greatly. As some things do both, and so on and so forth. There's discussions as to like whether or not like a talisman or an amulet, which one is temporary, which one gets exhausted in per use, which one can just be used and is kind of essentially forever turned on. But one book or collection that actually goes into quite some depth about this is a book called Amulets and Talismans of the Middle East and North Africa in Context by Marcela Gracia Probert and Petra M. Seibstein. And they have an introduction where they actually address this very directly. And what they say is as follows.
The distinction between amulets and talismans has been addressed by several scholars. An amulet has been described as an object endowed with magical powers used by the person who carries it. As it exercises its protective powers continuously, an amulet can be used by anyone to target different kinds of problems. By contrast, a talisman is only intended to perform one specific task. Therefore, it has to be made to cover the needs of the particular user in a defined situation. Its power exists from the moment it is activated, but it expires once its function is fulfilled. As we will see in the following pages, however, in practice, the difference in function between talismans and amulets is much more blurred.
And for the record, this book is actually available on Braille completely for free. It's completely open access, so you can read the whole thing if you want
Hell yeah.
for $0, and it's really good. It's quite excellent. So one thing that I like about this introduction is that it acknowledges already that even in setting up these distinctions, there is already a lot of blurring. So one of the things that they talk about, for example, is that some definitions of amulets and talismans are completely unique to certain disciplines and emerge entirely from the kind of material that is researched. So, for example, papyrologists always work with the material that has been inscribed, right? Whereas in other cases, you might have situations where in literary and book studies, that the reception of what counts as like, is this text a medicinal text? Is this text
Mm.
a magical text? Is this text a religious text? Depending on how we categorize it, this determines how the text will be perceived by scholars. Not necessarily how it was used originally when it was written, or how it was understood and used in its original cultural context before it arrives in a research library.
Mhm.
So texts related to amulets, for example, move through different genres. That's one of the things that the scholars in this book talk about. Like a text full of like written phylacteries can be interpreted very differently. Like once as medicinal, or like natural magic, as it were, or sometimes just entirely non-magical, and sometimes as religious because all the text of the phylacteries comes from the Bible or comes from a sacred, religious text, or like the Quran. And then in other situations, it's seen as purely magical.
Hmm. Yeah, it's always interesting to see when that licit and illicit authority tend to blend as well, be it a someone of priestly office, someone who has minor orders who is then pseudo sanctioned by the church to be like, okay, go do the thing that helps the people.
Yeah. And one thing that they really stress is that strict definitions about what is a talisman and what is an amulet is not only impossible when you're using these terms to translate concepts from other cultures. Like Salt just mentioned, like food talismans in China, like, well, we call them that, But, we also, Salt, you mentioned in the episode that we did on Tumasian that, for example, foxes can be called fairies, but like, what is the fox fairy and what does that relate to? Like, our understanding of the word fairy in English is very different.
Hmm. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And so one of the things they talk about is strict definitions of these terms is problematic because it artificially limits the object's identity to one particular function at a moment in time, right? Which is completely antithetical when you think about like drinking a phylactery because you wrote it down and then you drank it out of a bowl, or eating it, ingesting parts of the Bible, for example, or like putting things in the home or hanging them up or carrying them or hanging it around the neck of an animal or putting in the truck or a car. And so on and so forth, right? And so, like, while it's true that amulets are used generally for protection, the scholars also agree that they can be manufactured in a way that combines elements that tackle one particular threat or ailment. And while talismans can be meant to protect the target from a particular problem, they might be reused later in another context for general protection by another user. Because they could be inherited, right? And so,
Hmm.
like, even our whole episode on hagstones, which is another one of our early ones, really tackled a lot of these functions and how hagstones don't necessarily need to be activated. They perform their function inherently on their own, but then people do also consecrate them and dedicate them and use oral charms when finding them and pass them on to other people and so on and so forth. So in
Hmm.
general, the kind of rough schematics that they lay out is that they're linked together, they fulfill largely the same roles, but the main difference is function. So if an amulet is largely doing protective functions, a talisman is largely doing generative, like fortune drawing or some like drawing luck or love or these kinds of things. And of course, these things can be completely congruent because an amulet that protects a person from poverty or loneliness doesn't seem all that different in some ways from a talisman that draws companionship and money.
Yeah, it always makes me think about the culturally mediated causative agents of like the different conditions that one might turn to magic to address
Mm.
in terms of like certain understandings of we can get you this thing versus well you have a uh, illness of that thing or an illness that causes a lack of that thing. So even thinking back to some of our previous references to the PGM of be it like let it exercise this disease of poverty, let it exercise this disease of loneliness versus let us bring about an increase.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, Saul, I hope that gives some cushioning or context as to like where we're coming at with these terms and while fully acknowledging that they're going to be incredibly porous.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a slap up job right there. Like the I think the emphasis on context and just everything like that, it's so ambiguous. And
Mhm.
yet that's kind of the joy in talismans as as a means. Because the way they variate, right, makes such a fascinating exploration.
Yeah.
And I think one of like the biggest distinctions that we can kind of talk about in the European context specifically is obviously their presence in natural magic and ritual magic or necromancy, especially. You know, following not so much the magical distinction, but rather the what you would expect from clerical sources, where all ritual magic is technically necromancy, it's all technically heretical. Which obviously is not how magical sources describe their practices. Quite often, you'll find ritual magic text only addressing angels and so on, and these are considered within the hands of the authors at least, like permissive or licit magic. Whereas if you were to take this to a clerical authority, it would be condemned almost as much as, a work conjuring demons. That's kind of one of the joys of these terms. But
Mhm.
within the European context, there's really, two categories that predominate discussion of magic in general as a whole concept. And these are natural magic and ritual magic, ceremonial magic, whatever you want to phrase it. And these two categories are very closely related. When we divide them like this, it doesn't mean that they're hard distinctions. They can be at times, but especially ritual magic texts do tend to incorporate elements of natural magic, whether that's implicitly or explicitly. And we've talked a little bit about these distinctions before. Natural magic is really the practical application of what we call natural philosophy, the species and genera, and how these influence the world, how these can be used for esoteric purposes. And historically, it was socially quite acceptable because this natural magic, as it was called, was really presumed to operate on natural principles. If you read Della Porta, for example, some of the techniques he covers are more like very unscientific science experiments. And that's because what natural magic was in some ways was what we would call today a kind of early applied science with, very much emphasis on early science rather than contemporary usage of the term. And talismans were naturally one of the primary concerns in these works. So, for example, we see in The Secrets of Albertus Magnus the use of stones, herbs, animal components, where these natural objects are attributed to, occult qualities. So the talisman in this context is simply a natural object. There isn't necessarily anything done to it. It's simply understood as possessing certain capabilities on account of the qualities associated with it. Thus, we find sapphire, a generally dark and cold stone, influences the cold humors. We might find John's wort, for example, which is, hot, dry, fierce. And obviously, as a result, it's going to influence other humans as well. And Della Porta obviously makes a definition here, which Springer has added in.
Here are two sorts of magic. The one is infamous and unhappy, because it hath to do with foul spirits, and consists of enchantments and wicked curiosity. And this is called sorcery, an art which all learned and good men the rest. Neither is it able to yield any truth of reason or nature, but stands merely upon fancies and imaginations, such as vanish presently away, and leave nothing behind them, as Iamblichus writes in his book concerning the mysteries of the Egyptians. The other magic is natural, which all excellent wise men do admit and embrace, and worship with great applause. Neither is there anything more highly esteemed or better thought of by men of learning. The most noble philosophers that ever were, Pythagoras, Empedocles, Democritus, and Plato, forsook their own countries, and lived abroad as exiles and banished men, rather than as strangers, and all to search out and attain this knowledge. And when they came home again, this was in the science which they professed, and this they esteemed a profound mystery. They that have been most skillful in dark and hidden points of learning do call this knowledge the very highest point, and the perfection of natural science, insomuch that if they could find out or devise amongst all natural sciences any one thing more excellent or more wonderful than another, that they would still call it by the name of magic.
Fire Flames quote, to be honest.
The reason I put it in here is because what I really want to emphasize is that Renaissance thinkers like Giambattista della Porta, Agrippa, Marsilio Ficino, Gaetano Bruno, and even like Trithemius himself, of course, were very eager to define natural magic in opposition to diabolism, to say that, no, we're doing the real theurgy. This is a trick that Iamblichus also pulled against the Goetia, like we are doing genuine, legitimate, like scientific inquiry into the mysteries of God, like we're penetrating into the real occult hidden virtues. And this diabolic magic, which is involves like trickery and sorcery, and you're summoning spirits and potentially doing necromancy and so on and so forth. Like this is the work of either charlatans or impious men who've sold their souls. And Trithemius like justified his erudition in this way. because he was an exceedingly pious Catholic and a critic of sorcery, but he was also constantly accused of sorcery, right? So his way of justifying it was say, no, 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 that's what these other people are doing. What I'm doing is natural magic, which, to somebody who's persecuting these individuals, they're just going to be like, okay, whatever, potato, potato.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the really interesting parts of natural magic is the way in which its relationship with clerical authority, with religious orthodoxy changed and shift over time. Like Ficino himself is sat there both writing letters and casting horoscopes for the Pope, whilst also facing criticism from within the church, right? He was himself a priest.
Mhm.
And as a consequence, like the way in which that impacts the practical applications of natural magic and the ways in which it's used is quite stark. I think the most well-known text that kind of takes this polemical stance is probably Albertus Magnus, or pseudo Albertus Magnus's Speculum Astronomae, right? Like where he's basically dividing natural magic into two forms, which is the licit kind and the not so licit kind, which has overlap in his eyes with ritual magic and necromancy and the conjuration of spirits, which is not permissible to him. It's a condemnation of these texts. So the consequence of this, of course, is that we do find variations and like different forms of practice, which quite often seem very unfamiliar to those of us coming at it from a modern perspective, especially in the 21st century, now that we're kind of over the 20th century, like psychological approach and understanding of things. And so we find examples of these more like permissive forms of natural magic, of image magic, which may involve the spirits and souls of the stars, but doesn't really engage with them in a you're not conjuring them forwards. You're mostly focusing on like natural qualities, natural properties, things that are already present in nature. And because they're present in nature, how could it be a sin to access and move through these powers, right? Because these qualities, these powers that are being moved originate in the ideas or the intelligible forms of a particular substance or material. We call these, this power, the occult virtue, the hidden virtue. And that's obviously a major focus for authors like Agrippa, so on. Um, so yes, there is a spirit, a soul that is present through which these qualities must pass. Within the context of natural magic, the physical object itself is understood as possessing of these relevant qualities and powers that we need through these mediums. And, we talked about Sapphire and John's War earlier. These are examples of this, right? Like they have these qualities, and within early modern science, these were qualities that were just straight up associated with them. It's not really, it's not a magical thing to talk about a herb possessing hot and dry qualities, right? And so natural magic is very much conceptualized in this same capacity. And
Mhm.
natural magic, when it comes to talismans, quite often uses these natural materials, these natural qualities. It'll also engage in, engraving images, what we call image magic, which, you know, a lot of texts include this. Leopold of Austria's astrological text, the De Imaginibus, some of the works attributed to Salman Bisher, or as he's known in European sources, quite often Zale. And these works don't often include the conjuration of spirits in an explicit capacity. They do often include astrological timing, but they don't usually include conjuration of spirits. And this is one of the dividing lines between licit and illicit forms of natural magic, and where natural magic does start to overlap with ritual magic.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting how many times I've seen people debate as to like, can something even be called a talisman if it's not an astrological talisman? Like, obviously, yes, there's so many talismans that are not made through astrological elections, but people get very intense about astrological talismans, I've noticed on the
Hmm.
internet.com. And it's just one of those things where it's just like, I understand talismanic image magic is its own discipline, largely arising out of Arabic astrology.
Yeah,
However,
yeah.
there are many other things that have been called the name talisman, even within the Arabic and like Islamic traditions. And it is just, I mean, like all of the, like I'm thinking about all the ones that are just quotes from the Quran engraved, for example. And that's one of the things that this book that I was mentioning earlier does so well is it lists how many talismans specifically from the Middle East and North Africa that we can actually conceptualize and theorize and even complicate in light of how many like variations exist. So I just want to flag that like so you're absolutely right to point this out because like yes, people have drawn these lines between licit and illicit forms of natural magic depending on what is considered licit. I mean it's not we should not overlook that the Picatrix was considered to be like a particularly pernicious text, right? Like full of nasty magic essentially.
Yeah, I mean, oh God, it even mentions spirits. How scary is that? How could you do this,
Yeah,
King Alfonso?
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's a whole variety of texts of that nature, right? Like the so-called necromantic image magics that Sir Albertus Magnus is condemning, like the Liber Lunae, for example, books of Mansions of the Moon, which includes instructions for making talismanic rings during the moon's appearance in the mansions. And these rings are, they produce a variety of results, especially like they like to make things appear or illusionary magic, as Faulkner, describes
Mhm.
it. And I've done a few of those actually myself. One to Conjure Dragon, for example, was posted on the blog a while back. Actually, it was one of the first posts we made, even.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But these kind of works are like very much condemned by a lot of people who otherwise had no issue with natural magic. They had no issue with like Leopold of Austria's astrological elections, for example. Um, and you know, it's this latter group though, really, that we go a little bit beyond what was previously an emphasis on the natural qualities of talismans and start digging into the spiritual activity of them in a more explicit or proactive capacity. That is to say, the kind of one of the whole points of this is the appearance of spirits are either a necessity for the creation of or the intended result of the talisman in question, right? And then this obviously, by nature, brings us into ritual magic, where talismans are instrumental in the conjuration process, whether that's layman's, pentacles, so on. Where the consecration of these almost always, of course, requires some kind of conjuration, whether that's addressed to God or to ministering spirits or to the talisman itself. And I wanted to bring this distinction up because sometimes you will see a bit of a swing back towards the kind of despiritualization of the past century, where everything has to have spirits, everything has to be a proactive engagement with spiritual forces. And I don't think that really pays the respect due to the qualities inherent to the natural world itself. That is to say, like, yes, that is always the preferred method. Don't get me wrong. If anyone knows me, they know I'm not saying, oh, this is, you know, superior in any capacity. But kind of what I'm saying is that it is evident that there was space for this. There is evidently room for talismans to be predominated by their natural qualities rather than necessary proactive conjurations. Because the funny thing about natural magic is that someone practicing it isn't necessarily going to consider themselves a magician. A lot of natural magic was used by physicians, for example. We even see, if you're making galenic concoctions, a lot of the principles are very, very similar to those found in natural magic texts, medicines, for example. And so there is evidently room for that when we're talking about these talismans. But of course, the preferred method is if you can involve spirits into the consecration process, your own, moving the souls of the actual materials themselves, then this is going to be ideal for evident reasons. I just don't want to start with this because I do think it's beneficial to recognize that not every talisman or amulet requires this to have some kind of effect. And there's ours, evil eye talismans are a good example of that, that in the English speaking world have become a more common sight. I think, evil eye protections were already common elsewhere and they used to be common in the European context as well. But it's easy for people to sniff and be snobby and be like, oh, it's just a symbol, it hasn't been consecrated, so it can't do anything. And I don't know, I don't agree with that. The natural qualities
Mhm.
of the image itself have virtue, they have properties, and these qualities are going to be stronger when you go through the whole process of consecrating them, however you want to do it, sure. But if we want to talk about respecting or possessing a worldview where everything is a spirit, everything is ensouled, then we should probably, respect the power inherent to that thing because of its nature, and also the power present in the created world as it expressed and made manifest through natural objects, materials, shapes, and images, and so on.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Not to mention, like, there's so many, even like among the grimoires, right? Like, oh, just show this symbol to the spirits and they will obey. or just show them this particular sign and they have to fear it, or like all spirits will
Mhm.
have to like, or this particular kind of spirit will have to obey. Like even within the context of like book and folk magic, for example, there's certain symbols and signs where like if you show it to a particular spirit, they're supposed to like agree to what you're saying, or they're supposed to like not necessarily just fear the symbol in the way that the cross can be feared, for example, but like there's certain ones that like around certain kinds of spirits, they're just meant to inherently be like, oh, like I know what that is, and that is the sign of a spirit that I actually obey. Like that is a sign of one of my superiors. And so
Mhm.
if you make it, I'm gonna see that as an emissary of that particular overseer spirit in the high, the chain of beings will.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like, and when it comes down to sometimes I've sworn over sometimes they have different relationships with it, right? Like we talk about like the qualities of antipathy and using certain things to drive out spirits. And those things aren't necessarily consecrated. It's just that their qualities are, poisonous or unpleasant for the spirit to be around. And so it doesn't want to be around that particular place or object where that is. Like, sometimes you put the wrong plant in your room and certain spirits don't want to show up anymore because they're like, oh, he's a, you know, we don't get on.
Yeah. I mean, even the Seal of Solomon itself, right? Or like, what is the ring that Solomon received from the Archangel Michael or whomever that allows him to control the spirits? Is kind of inherently on its own having this virtue.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I think on the level of culturally ingrained apotropaic images and apotropaic talismans, then you run into these situations where some shit just works.
Hmm.
Um, regardless of, in some cases, even consecration, or whatever other virtue going on. Like, just to go back to the case of the evil eye, like the Nazar that we discussed earlier, or like the Hagstone. Like over time, I guess some of these things just step forward as effective, and their efficacy perpetuates their efficacy later on
Yeah,
down the
yeah.
line.
Or like the cornicello and stuff in Italy.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm. I just want to bracket because we've had Gary on, Gary Noriyuki on the podcast a couple times. Thai amulets, a whole beast of their own, right? And can be made for every purpose and
Oh,
be
yeah.
everything from super Buddhist to super necromantic and everything in between and things, all those things together. And just like they're not all like always like containing 10,000 ingredients. Sometimes it's just one piece of
Mhm.
sacred wood. It's been prayed over so many times that it just now has a consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. Or like old school talismans containing, 1 to 3 different herbs that the contra doctor or the, priest of whatever tradition just breathes on and puts in a bag and hands to you.
Yeah, yeah.
Is like, I think, as complicated as these things can be, they often don't need to be.
Mm,
Um, it just reminds me of this conversation I was having the other day with another magician friend of the show, where like some things don't need to be complicated unless they have to be complicated.
yeah, yeah.
Should you be able to put the rosemary in the bag, then it will do the thing.
Man is actually putting the rosemary in the bag.
Rosemary oil fries.
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
snack bag.
Hmm.
So, actually talking of materials, Kate isn't the only one who likes smooth transitions. Um, when it comes to talismans, right, and we're talking about the material objects, what are they made from? And I just want to note for our readers that the first bullet point here is fucking anything.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It literally is. The first bullet point is anything.
Mhm.
Natural materials are one of the most common, right? Like the three kingdoms of vegetable, mineral, and animal.
Hmm.
Mhm.
So, you have materials that are sympathetic to the sun, sympathetic to hot and like moist qualities, or those that are, have a sympathy to a particular condition that you're trying to heal, or particular sympathies to spirits, like we're kind of, I'm overemphasizing the natural magic element here, but I think that's because we're talking about ma natural materials and substances. But there's so many different, elements of that that can be used in a talisman. And so we find when we're I mean, I would say like nearly every single talisman, not all of them, but the vast majority of them do have some kind of natural or organic substance in them. Now, whether or not those are processed, it's another question entirely.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we should talk a little bit about, the fact that we use, paper and ink. We talked about like ones that are just completely from holy texts. Like we talked a lot about that in the Incantation Bowl episode, or we discussed how like a lot of these are just straight up direct copy pastes from the Bible or from religious pamphlets that were circulating as books of prayer.
Mhm.
And then there's also obviously, as Saul was mentioning, signs and seals and so on and so forth. But like their construction completely varies between lineage, like instructions on how to consecrate them and what it takes to activate them. And also whether or not they are just like inherent, like natural charms, like a snail shell or a hagstone, or a serpent's vertebrae, or if there's something that needs to be activated in some way or consecrated. So maybe we could talk a little bit about some examples. Salt, I think that you obviously going to chat astrology, if I'm correct.
Yeah, so like I think when we're talking about astrological talismans, the main thing to look at is the process, right? And how it is taking shape. As far as like the materials, generally speaking, it's as simple as, finding the materials sympathetic to both the planet and the qualities that you are looking to exert. Taking two herbs belonging to Mars isn't necessarily going to produce the same talisman, right? Because they have their own unique qualities, their own reasons for their relation to Mars to be what it is. This is kind of one of the, consequences of people getting too fixated on correspondence. This is they just look for any martial herb or, any martial stone or any martial animal, which obviously, the qualities of a dog are very, very different from the qualities of a red pepper.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but they're both martial, right? So obviously we want to pay attention to that when we're considering the material that we're going to be using in these astral talismans. And once we have that material, once we know what we're doing with it, we're gonna find the suitable time, the electional time. And usually we want to do this with a horoscopic method, when we're going for something like a, ta natural astrological talisman. We do want to use horoscopy for that. So usually people would follow the methods given in Agrippa or the Picatrix, for example. Dignifying the planet, ensuring it's in a good state in the stars. That it's angular, especially in the first and the 10th, is kind of the favored positions, but there is actually room for the seventh and the fourth, depending on what you're doing. And what you want to do then is take that materials that we just described, that we just discussed, and fashioning it into an image, combining it all together. Engraving the image of a soldier into a ruby or iron for Mars is an example of that. And at the most basic level, that is sufficient. And the reason for that is because of the qualities of the time, because of the qualities of the material, because the light of the planet itself is descending down at that time. That's why we put him, that's why we make him angular, so he's prominent, so that he's very strong. And his talisman is fashioned, it's born at this time. But we can obviously ramp that up, right? Like this is the most bare bones. This is the most fundamental method. Now, we want to complicate it. We can start introducing incense. We can introduce, we can fumigate the talisman. We can address conjurations, introducing or conversing with the spirit of the planet and the material themselves as well, right? We want to speak to the souls of those things or move them in some capacity, whether or not they can speak back to us. And we can, as preparatory steps, if we want, start following planetary hygiene, dieting and dressing in accordance with the star, eating a lot of sour and pungent foods, garlic, peppers, since we're talking about Mars. We can conduct ourselves in a capacity that draws down those qualities and virtues. And all of this does, it follows the principles of natural magic we've been talking about for half the episode so far. It introduces these virtues, these occult virtues, these qualities that we're seeking out for the purpose of the ritual. And they, at the moment of the talisman's birth, are essentially enshrined within it. These processes help us become a medium, a intermediary to ensure that this process goes smoothly, to ensure that, we're not bringing ourselves into it or unclean or antipathic influences. And through this, we have a talisman, basically. But you can see, right, like the procedure itself varies. There's very simple expressions of it. And then you can gradually get more and more complicated as it goes on, as it proceeds. And are these steps necessary? It depends on who you ask. I think it's generally best to follow them for, the most efficacious results. Like it is one of those topics where the more you put in, generally speaking, the more you get out of it. Um, just I would say with astrological talismans, generally speaking, you actually don't want 100 different resources like he was talking about earlier. It's one of those things where simplicity is actually preferred as far as the materials, at least, because you are usually looking for quite specific virtues, quite specific qualities, and the various interactions between all of the materials, the more complicated it becomes, the harder it is to sort out these particulars. So that's kind of how it's done in the astrological context, at least. But that's very distinct from other methods, right? Like ritual magic talismans, for example, like pentacles. When we construct pentacles, it's very distinct. Yeah, that's kind of the approach I go. What about you guys? Like, what would when we talking about like examples of making talismans, is there any that kind of stand out to you guys as like exemplary?
For me, I was thinking about the Auron, which isn't always Mandrake. It can be other things, but Pliny the Elder, of course, talks to about those who dig Mandragora have to avoid a wind blowing in their faces. They have to make 3 circles with a sword and then dig looking to the west. There's lots and lots of like lore out there about like what it is to exactly extract a mandrake. We have Flavius Josephus, Barris Root testimony going much the same way, right? We have all kinds of references in the PGM about like pulling out roots, and specifically using like a wormwood root, for example, and then carrying it as a fetish. And obviously we have a lot of medieval sources as well about henbane root, from Alexander of Tralles, being hung around the neck of a patient to bring medical relief. And in the Norse and Germanic context, we have the Auron very strongly. And we also have like all kinds of like beautiful syncretism around like the notion of the mandrake at the gallows, right? So like from Johann Schmidl, we know that like if a man was unjustly hung for theft, it's said that from his urine or from his ejaculate that is dispensed right upon his death, a root will form, and the Germans call it the Auron, and then to dig it, it causes great danger. And anyone who hears the groans that come from the earth when they dig it will die on the spot. And so there's like just so much we could talk about with the Auron, but I wanted to emphasize that in general, as an amulet, if you will, or as a talisman, plants have always been on their own without even much preparation, potential talismans and amulets. And in fact, I think Bald's Leech book is pretty much full of them, right?
Oh yeah,
Mm.
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much about like, oh, just carry this one particular plant on you and that will do its thing. But in general, when it comes to mandrakes and obtaining them, there's all kinds of different methods. We'll do a mandrake episode one day, I'm sure, or some kind of Auron episode. But I'm just mentioning right now that in general, the idea of a root and Hildegard von Bingen especially goes into a great deal about like how it should be pulled, when it's being dug, what time it should be found, how you should tie it, how you should like carry it and so on and so forth, where you should put it on you and so on and even more, right? And of course it's not just Mantrix, it's Henbane and Hellebore and Valerian and Aconite and God knows what else, in terms of all different kinds of things like Angelica root, like campaign and so on, that is that are used as root fetishes, but like the Almond is a very particularly famous one. And it's just worth noting that here's an example of something that like the care is less in its consecration. Obviously, you do feed it, sometimes your semen, your milk, your blood, who knows, but it's more in its harvesting. So you're not necessarily doing anything terribly new to the spirit of the plant. You're actually just allowing it to be harvested in a way where the spirit remains intact. And that's what gives it that property.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I always love the treatment of natural artifacts, um, especially those who have been born or grown in weird circumstances, as a means of creating talismans themselves,
Mhm.
or even using as like a materia in the creation of other talismans, like circumstance of harvest. We talked about this a little bit in episode 49 on plants,
Mhm.
manner of growth being just as important as any other factor in the creation of these things.
Yeah. And I gotta give a quick shout out to our boy, if we can call him that, Claude Lecoteau, because he has a great book called The High Magic of Talismans and Amulets, which literally goes over Albertus Magnus, Agrippa, gives all kinds of different, like, looks into, like, rabbit's feet and lucky horseshoes, more simplistic charms in this way, and gives a history of them, from around the world in Lecoteau's usual systematic way,
Mm-hmm.
with a lot of good cross-cultural comparison.
Mm-hmm. Sure, let's look it up.
Always the only author so far to be featured twice in our monthly book club on Patreon.
Very true.
Hmm.
Other authors get on it.
Yeah.
But yeah. Um, I think just to go back to the question, for me, the um exemplary talisman, as it were, is the pan cultural global format of three herbs in a bag.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is like, um, keeping it simple, keeping correspondence centered, and uh, not to co-opt the phrase work hunting, but like keeping in mind the balance of the temperaments, the dispositions, the virtue, the manner of growth and harvest of everything that goes inside, and just relying on the paths of the person constructing it to ensure that with the minimal by comparison of what other recipes can call for, list of ingredients that go into them, still being able to make miracles.
Hmm.
Absolutely, yeah. I think the interactions between the materials is quite often one of the, most important elements in making a talisman, right? Like even when we're like using consecrated inks, for example, and there's some materials that do really well across the board, right? Like I think myrrh is a great example of a materia that when it's used in the creation of any kind of spiritual artifact, not even just talismans, like, but as an incense, like as a fumigation, as a tool for consecration, it's so the qualities of myrrh itself just, lend itself to anything you want, right? It's kind of an intermediary substance that can carry other virtues, other things are easily impressed onto it. Similar to water, actually, in a lot of respects. Because, with water, you have general water, but you also have like swampy water. You have hot water, spicy water. These are very distinct from what you would normally expect. Like there's different qualities attributed to that. And in that respect, like I think when it comes to these materials, that's one of the things to look out for is to look out for those golden boys who can do so much work and kind of carry everyone else with them as well, acting as a support and assistant to the other materials. It's one of the fun things about constructing talismans, constructing spiritual artifacts in general, I find, is figuring out or learning from your spirits what is suitable for that kind of thing. Um, and I think really where the natural, point to progress from the subject of materia is the function of it, because obviously the materia is going to inform the function. What we use to construct a talisman with the process we use to consecrate it and bless it is going to ultimately determine what it does, right? And I think like the natural instinctive image in our mind is wearing them.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
it's like, you have something tied around your neck or put on your arms, for example.
Hmm.
For me, like when I think talisman, for some reason, subconsciously the image is like a necklace. That's the main image that comes to my mind. Obviously, very distinct in reality. Um, for other people, it might be a piece of yellow paper with some very fancy calligraphy written on it, sealed with three ticks on the top.
Mhm.
For other
Yeah, yeah,
people, it
yeah.
might be a stick.
I love collecting good stick.
Mhm.
I think
Sticks are
were we talking about what were we talking about in the Hexen episode? Witches love a forked stick and a hold stone.
Very true.
It's just true. I think it's also worth noting that, like, some of these synonyms or, cognates or general words that, sometimes I like to use the word charm sometimes because it's a bit more neutral and doesn't imply things as in some ways that other terms use. But, like, I love also fetish,
Mhm.
which comes from, of course, the Latin, that enters into the Portuguese as fetiço, and then to French as fetiche, and then English fetish, right? And of course it means all kinds of things over time. Originally an artificial object into a sorcerous object into an object that has magical power. Because the original factitious is manufactured, right? With like the connotation of artificiality. If you want to learn a bit more about the etymology of fetishes and of specifically the Alaran and root fetishes, and particular herbal talismans, there's an excellent class by Occulta, which is
Mhm.
herbal talismans, root fetishes, and Alaraner. And I'm really, really want to encourage folks to check that out and buy it from Occulta herself, Julia Carreras, because it's fantastic and just absolutely wonderful. So one of the things that I guess I just wanted to note specifically is that, like, for some people, using one of these terms inherently means there was an imbued magical power that was given to it by a practitioner. And for others, it could mean it's ensouled, like there is a spirit
Mhm.
inside of that particular thing. Like usually when I personally use the word fetish, I mean like it's inspirited, like there's a spirit lives in that. It's not just like imbued with magical power, it's just a living being inside of it. But at the same time, on an animist level, everything is a living being. It's just a matter of, like, does it have a personality? Does it necessarily interact with you as an agent? Um,
Mhm.
Mhm.
Like the whole, is it enlivened? Are each of the materials that go into it forming the skeleton of some greater than the sum of its parts consciousness?
mhm.
And when it comes to like, making use of talismans, right, like practical applications of them once we have it all made, once it's prepared, how do you guys like to go about that?
Hmm. Um, I mean, obviously wearing them. That's the place that we go first, like you mentioned earlier, with the necklace being the mental image, or any sort of, ring, bracelet, armband, uh, crown, whatever have you.
You love an
Oh yeah,
armband, I've noticed.
It's true. Very true.
Hmm.
Always helps
listen,
out.
we gotta rep the paper Christmas crowns. Like
We do. It's
Mhm.
true.
I just out of everything, it's the paper crowns that gets me, to be
Mhm.
honest.
Mhm.
Especially like, the magical trios of Solomon and so on. It's just like I can't really see myself getting into that particular one personally.
Mhm.
Someone in our Discord server put a picture of the like a Burger King crown, paper crown
Oh my
with
God.
Aoth Abraoth Basim Isak Sabaoth EO on it. And it just says the Stele of Have It Your Way. And I've thought about it every day since.
Mhm. Likewise.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, it's fantastic.
who hasn't bootlegged the crown of art from the headless ritual before, right?
Literally, yeah. I've made that shit on some real flimsy paper before.
Mhm.
And now I have papyrus. Yeah. But so to go back to your question, I want to add to the pile ingestion. So
Mhm.
like ingesting a talisman because it was written on something edible or it was licked off of maybe, let's say, oh, I don't know, an egg
Mhm.
at dawn, licked off of it in edible mer ink. Key would know about this.
Egg.
Egg. Oh my God. Thank you for joining me on that journey.
Mhm.
For those who don't know, it's the PGM to meet your own daemon. Check out withcunningcommand.com. We have an article
Mhm.
on it. It was some real it was amazing. It also was truly some like bodybuilder Sigma male, morning
Mhm.
routine shit that Key and I were on.
Yeah.
Crack an egg into your mouth directly raw and
Mhm.
lick the myrrh off of it, and also recite Gnostic scripture at like dawn.
Mhm. Dunk your face in some ice water, drink your sparkling water, the whole.
No, I
Hit that Wim Hof, you know.
you gotta hit the Wim Hof. Yeah, it's straight up 4 hours of fuck shit as your morning routine if you're a real Sigma male. Just 4 hours of tomfoolery, 4 minutes of diving into your pool. Okay, if you know what we're talking about, if you've seen that guy's routine, God
Mhm.
bless. Um,
Get those banana peels over here.
God, stop with I can't. I can't. Uh, I
Oh
fucking
man.
not Ashton Hall's morning routine. Listen, 4 hours of straight dilly-dallying. No, I've done it worse for magic, so I can't
Mhm.
even. At least I had effect stone in my real life. Like the Virgin, whatever he's doing, versus the Chad Patrick Bateman morning routine. Like all these
Dude.
Sigma males can't even they pale in comparison like to the average like TikTok girl with a skincare routine. Like they're on some crazier sociopathic shit.
Mhm.
Anyway, ingesting talismans. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's one of the classics there, isn't it? Like ingesting like the oil plates and like bowls of water, right? Like letting
Yeah,
the
yeah,
ink
yeah.
run off into the water and drinking it.
Especially if it's like from a particular holy text.
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. Or like in China as well, it's like one of the common ways you'll see it used is food talismans that are ingested through the ashes specifically.
Hmm.
And I think that kind of brings up like, the concept of consumable talismans to begin with, right? Like burning them to ashes, both for ingestion, also to send messages to spirits or impress them on things, to scatter them to the wind. Sometimes if they require it, maybe to activate them, right? Like some talismans need to be burned to be activated. Um, and this can be, the context of like command talismans, for example. Some of those will be used, like burnt specifically, so that the spirit has that talisman heated and printed on them.
Mhm.
There's also, we touched on this when you guys were talking about like fetishes specifically, where a talisman is a medium for a spirit or deity, right? Like it's a kind of
Hmm.
representation of it or some aspect of its power. Sometimes it's even enshrined, especially if you have a discrete practice due to living concerns and can't make a shrine where you have like active idols. You can probably make an innocuous enough talisman. And this is where the definition for talisman comes into play, right? Because is it a talisman if it's being treated as an idol? And some forms of idol are very evidently talismans specifically. Like if you have a piece of paper with specific words written on it, like no graven images, no like something that is identifiable as the image of a god. Is it a talisman? Is it an idol? Is it both? Realistically, I think the answer is probably both, right? And obviously when we have a talisman in that context, it's a vessel for a spirit to act through, to move through, to see through. It's, that is the function of the talisman, is to be that spirit's tool, to be a weapon for that spirit, rather than producing a singular outcome or attracting certain virtues or blessings. Its function is as a medium, and sometimes it's a medium for multiple spirits even, like a certain talisman that's intended to relate to a large number of spirits or a family of spirits or a troop of spirits. And I think that ties into like talismans as ritual implements as well. Like we talk about command talismans intended to command, compel, sometimes coerce or exercise certain spirits into appearing or obeying. Sometimes you'll even have talismans, explicitly prepared to make spirits depart. Like I'm
Mhm.
not so much talking about like incense fumigations, but like specific images or seals that are like, I have the authority to make you come at my leisure. I also have the authority to make you leave when you don't want to. Get out. Um, and sometimes it's ritual implements as well. We're not just looking to move spirits, but also to purify the room of its presence or assert qualities over a particular space, which I know Key, the man of many materials, is really well suited to speak about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
Like, there are so many different directions that you can go using talismans, in this context to manipulate a given environment. Like, sometimes, different traditions having different understandings of things, obviously, but creating talismans like the ones that I recently made against the ambient dead that serve as almost vacuum cleaners from the environment that are constructed in such a way that they create an empty vessel that uh, ambient dead can adhere to and be nullified in their effect. Or even, in the more sources manipulation of that, once you have absorbed the ambient dead, taking the pieces of those talismans that break off as a result of their having absorbed something, crushing them up and then putting them in your malefic powders, which I'm not saying to do, but I'm saying is an idea. But, really as well, different technologies where you break the talisman into multiple different pieces. And by that, I don't literally mean break it, but like put some subset of the ingredients in one bag, put some subset of the ingredients in another, and so on. And then install them in like the four corners of the room or the four corners of the house. And then that will make the entire room behave in some ways as the composite talisman, especially when combined with other technologies, um, but also just like having different talismans that are ensouled to different extents be kept and respected in certain ways. Like, if I have certain ensouled talismans, which I do, I'm going to keep them on the top floor of my house because I don't want them being walked over by other beings, just as a particular taboo. Similarly, some I will only ever keep in the basement because they're ensouled and need to be underground. So there's some variation there, but really it just comes down to, once you're in the environmental manipulation category, understanding that the virtue can incorporate the room itself. You can make the room itself into the talisman. Um, Versus, once we get into ensouled territory or having portals to different realms of spirits and deities by nature of the scripture inscribed or whatever incantations is inscribed, then being a bit more careful and respecting that as a means of influencing a space all its own.
So what you're telling me is that you have a talisman that helps you ensure the room is the right temperature to practice the Wim Hof method. Wow, that's incredible, bro.
You yeah, you just draw an image of Wim Hof and then you ingest it as you're doing the inner fire, right?
Oh my God.
That's terrifying. Okay,
I I
wow.
did really dislike that very strongly. I'd rather ingest an image of like a Wojak.
The ingestion part was a
Uh,
lot.
Oh man. But yeah, to the earlier ingestion point though, like ingesting the command talismans, having the ash of the scripture that lets you subjugate other spirits kind of imbued onto your tongue at any given time, either immediately preceding a vocation or, just doing it once and hoping it's good forever, which wink wink nudge nudge might be.
or like
Yeah.
even like the lunar mansions and the talismans you can make for them as
Mhm.
like image magic and how they can be like worn and like used or venerated and shrined.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah. Or
Yeah.
even like what is the virtue of the particular amulet or talisman in question and being seen or not seen? Like
Mhm.
we all know the stories of like, oh, don't let anyone see or touch the mojo hand that is given to you and has a name that it responds to by the conjure doctor that gave it to you. And then versus like, let's say, mm, the Pentacles of Venus that you're supposed to actually show people.
Right, right.
So, for example, the third, which, attracts love if you show it to somebody. Um, and whereas the fourth does not necessarily, is not, it just calls people to come unto you, but it doesn't necessarily have to be shown. But the fifth does. It says, and shown unto any person whatsoever, it inciteth and exciteth wonderfully unto love. So, like, there's these different, like, particular rules as to like, are you supposed to reveal it? Has that power in secrecy or does it have power in being revealed?
Hmm.
People love their like talismanic image magic rings and they love flashing them.
Yeah, they
Just as
really
an
do.
aside. Just a little like they just act like Thanos. Like
Hmm. We've all been in that Zoom meeting where someone will, cross lace their fingers together with 10 rings and be like, hello.
I know, it's really
It's not
fucking
subtle. Yeah.
it's obvious and all three of us were there for that.
Hmm. Please put your talismans in the background like the rest of us.
Not the blurred image in the back.
Exactly, yeah. But
God.
like also just to invoke a technique that we've talked about a couple times on the show before of like if you make a figure of someone or a doll or an image or consecrate a skull candle as a particular person you're looking to enchant, having the eyes of that figure or the ears or whatever it may be, looking constantly upon that talisman, especially those ensouled or consisting of an image, is a good vector of a more distant juju that doesn't entail one having to flash the rings on the Zoom meeting.
Yeah. I think this would be a good place to make mention of phylacteries.
Hmm.
The word phylactery comes from the ancient Greek, originating in phylakterion, which means safeguard or amulet or like, a protection.
Hmm.
And certainly phylakterios from phylakter, which is watcher or guard. So these are all about protection, right? And normally we talk about phylacteries as sometimes in like the Old Testament context as the small of the box containing sacred texts that can be worn or remind oneself of religious obligations in the Jewish tradition. But also extend hugely to like Greek papyrus magic. Also extends hugely into Coptic and Greek and Aramaic and Babylonian magic.
Hmm.
The PGM is particularly, I'm going to use as my case study here, is quite full of them. There's an excellent phylactery against demons, super simple in PGM 4, 86 to 87. There's also one in PGM 4, 3007 to 86 that's specifically for those possessive demons. So the phylactery is actually written on a tin lamella and then hung on the patient. One of my favorites examples of phylacteries in the PGM is PGM 4 1227 to 64, which is an excellent rite for driving out diamonds. You have like essentially 7 olive branches, and 6 of them you tie together, 2 ends of them, and you use as a whip. But you're supposed to like keep
Hmm.
it secret. And so essentially you have this whole conjuration that you give when you're like, asperging this person. And when you drive at the daemon, you hang a phylactery around them, which is por por, it's that classic formula. And it's just written on a tin metal leaf. So, it's one part exorcism and one part phylactery that then keeps the exercise spirit out. So it's one thing to get the spirit out of you, it's another thing to keep them out of you. And this is what the phylactery achieves, to create like an aura around you where the spirit can no longer return.
Hmm.
There is, of course, an incredibly wonderful all-purpose phylactery in the Consecration for All Purposes, the Spelt Helios, the very famous PGM for 1596 to 1715. Our friend Alison Tchaikovsky has an excellent pamphlet from Hadean Press on this, so check it out. And of course, the OG baddie phylactery. Also, shout outs to Allison from Practical Occult on this one. It's PGM 7, 579 to 90, which is a phylactery, a bodyguard against all demons and phantasms, every sickness and suffering, which you write on gold or silver or tin or papyrus. And it's the one with the Ouroboros, right? So you have like the serpent eating its own tail, and then it says, protect my body and the entire soul of me name, along with the particular characters and the
Hmm.
actual barbarous words of power. And it's great. I have one of these on tin, and I have my name on it, and it actually is suspended from a completely different charm that I made. So it's suspended off of the a horseshoe that I have over my bed. And on the other side, what's suspended is one of those like double-sided discovery of witchcraft charms against spirits. Just to keep some of my bed protection. So I
Hmm.
love that one. It's a great one. It's also super easy to make. There is no reason. Folks, get some papyrus and just make this with ink and consecrate it, and then roll it up and put it in one of those little like Michaels or whatever, tube, charms that you can just hang off a necklace and just wear it, and you're good to go. It'll cost you like what, nothing, Highly recommend doing this one. It gives a lot of really good protection. It's easy to wear as well, or keep in your purse.
Hmm.
Um, and there's also phylacteries for daily fever and shivering fits, right? So there's phylacteries that keep out disease in that way. One example is PGM 7, 218 to 21. And I have to shout out the Oracle of Kronos. Uh,
Unreal.
PGM 4, 3086 to 3124. Check it out on withcunningcommand.com. I wrote a post about it, explaining my experience actually performing this ritual. The phylactery that you have to have on you to protect you from Kronos when he shows up, because he'll be upset with you when you call him, is made on a piglet's rib. So this is a sexually mature pig. We've talked about this before on the show, so I won't rehash it too much. And it contains an image of, in addition to one of the names of Zeus, it contains an image of him wielding a sickle. And really, what this is doing is reminding Kronos of his castration. And it's saying that, behold, this is the factory that protects me. And there's even an additional component, which is you say a particular formula that compels Kronos when he shows up. And in order to not get him super mad at you, you have the phylactery, which not only ensures that he obeys, but also protects you from his wrath. And the reason it's carved on the rib of a piglet is because piglets were a common sacrifice to Chthonic deities.
Oh, so
Mm.
delicious.
Allegedly, yeah.
I can confirm. I can confirm.
I trust you. I'm just a vegetarian, so like I'm like I buy meat all the time for my spirits. God knows I'm in traditions that, anyway. But like I just don't get to partake of it myself very often.
It's okay. Me and the Chthonic spirits can do it for you.
It's very true. You can and you do, and I've cooked for you many a time.
And she can cook.
Yeah, and y'all know I make a good Mongolian beef noodle.
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
hmm You guys have both benefited from that.
Hmm. Goddamn. What phylactery do you have that makes you cook good?
Yeah, well, it's the one that it wards off the diseases of lack of taste.
Hmm. True, true.
It wards off the demons of no taste, of staleness. We should make like a charm that like keeps your bread from going stale.
Oh, we should.
Yes, necessary.
Necessary.
So one of the hot cross bun benefits, when Good Friday, Easter, hang it up over the oven.
Yeah, legit. Speaking of talismans, can I just say that when you, put talisman into Wikipedia or whatever like that, one of the first things that shows up is the Talisman of Charlemagne, which is a reliquary that allegedly holds a fragment of the True Cross, and
Mm-hmm.
Charlemagne was buried with it. And I was just like, that's fucking badass. He's dripped out, okay? This is some like Egyptian pharaoh shit. Google
Hmm.
it. Google it and scry it. It's fascinating stuff. Scry it
Yeah.
and tell me if it actually contains a shard of the True Cross.
It is a very bejeweled talisman at that.
It is absolutely bejeweled. It's absolutely bedazzled. And I have to say, as an Orthodox, because we just talked about Charlemagne, so I now have to switch, pivot the entire conversation to my culture. What about me? What about me? I just gotta say, those of you who've been in the Balkans, you know that the strongest taxi drivers have the most icons on their dashboard.
It's very true.
The more prayer ropes hanging off the rearview mirror, the more tiny pocket icons taped to the dashboard, the more powerful and faster your, 2-decade-old car is.
It's
Doesn't
very
the
true.
doesn't the bobblehead Jesus on the dash like triple the speed alone?
I think the bobblehead Jesus and like the car saints that you can like are also equally very, very powerful, but I'm just saying that surface area wise, you can ha just equip more icons, and they give you +5 holiness and +5 tenacity.
Hmm.
Key, now that you've been to the Balkans, can you confirm this?
I can, yeah. The God's strongest taxi driver is the homie Theodoros, who has 6 icons of Theodoros on the dash.
Oh my God. That actually was true. That's a real story.
Hmm.
Yes, and he was great, and he was came in clutch in Cyprus for us.
Hmm. Very true.
Hmm.
Or they'll pull out the phone and hit you with the Google Translate, "Are you Orthodox?" And
And I was like, yes, and then with a key, and I told him in German, don't respond to that.
and then proceeded to get a very good rate thanks to the patron saints on the dash.
Truly.
It's like you got to stay strapped. You got Saint George for when anyone's weird, Saint Demetrius for when anyone's weird. You got but yeah, keep it
Oh yeah,
going. 6 different Marys.
gotta do it.
We've also
Got to
got
go
the
fast.
talismanic number plates, right? Like you see some people spending a fortune to get the number plate for their car, so that it's got, 888 on it, for example.
Mm.
Yeah, legit.
The There's actually fun fact for obviously when I was working security, a lot of the residential sites we had they were called like Asian style, but this is kind of talismanic in a sense, or rather not so much talismanic, maybe apotropaic. But a lot of these residential sites, if they had a large Chinese population, no fourth floor, no units with the number four on them, and let me tell you, when you're working on those sites, it makes it a bit of a nightmare sometimes because you're just like thinking, like trying to count the number of floors you have to do right. And your natural instinct is just completely forget that there is no fourth floor on this property.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Mhm.
so real. I mean, even we're talking about this with Red, who was on episode 26, Red who once that's just like you can't even rent a place with a four in it because it's pronounced the same as death.
Mhm. Yeah.
Inauspicious,
Yeah,
inauspicious.
deeply inauspicious.
This reminds me of the skyscrapers that don't include a 13th floor.
Yeah, yeah.
Same reason.
Hmm.
It all counts, right? All adds up.
13 is lucky for me.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. That's why I was making in 13s. Yeah.
Indeed. I guess another thing to talk about then is spirit seals.
Oh yeah. I think that's one of the most interesting and also something you don't see touched on too much, right? Like as far as very explicit discussions, you don't see too much like argument on the subject, but you do see a lot of, like for example, if you're on Etsy, one of the first things you'll see when you're looking up like occult materials or talismans is those Goetia rings, right? Like seals with
Oh
from
yeah,
the
yeah,
Ars
yeah.
Goetia.
Or even like
Um,
lemons to a lesser extent.
yeah, yeah. And I think it's good to kind of examine what it means for, what a spirit seal is. And just like talismans, the definition is kind of difficult because there's not actually a singular answer. Um, I think the best way we can kind of come to a definition of it is saying like, hey, the seal is associated with the either substance and nature of the spirit itself or their arrival and appearance. Because, the various forms of them, right? You have some seals that are signatures, in the same way that, me or you would write our name out, and then this is now a sympathetic link by which someone can conjure us and maybe potentially influence someone. This is also a sympathetic link to the spirit. And that's also, partly why harming a spirit seal can be injurious to them. Sometimes it's an expression of the spirit itself, like we talked about talismans being a medium for the spirit. And in a sense, when a spirit seal is taking on this capacity, it is obviously very intense in that manner. Um, but also outside of that, right, there's the talismans that aren't necessarily related to the spirit themselves, but it's something they've sworn an oath over that they recognize. You actually mentioned this earlier in the episodes, Finger, like talking about seals that they acknowledge, right, that they respect. And
Mhm.
sometimes that respect is, you know, through mutual relationships or respect for their officers or chiefs. Sometimes it's something that compels or commands them, especially in the context of demons, fallen angels, and so on. One of the results of me asking the spirits about some seals was them saying, like, this isn't actually mine, it's the spirit that commands and compels me, which I found really fascinating. Um, and obviously, one of I think this is something that you've also looked into quite a bit, Key, is the seals that are like produced through rules, right? So that we take the name of the spirit, and
Mm.
according to something like a Kamiya seal or even the Golden Dawn's like Rose method, and we draw it out through the name, through this like table or numbers and so on. And I find that process really interesting because
Mhm.
we're essentially taking the qualities of the name, right? And we're transposing that into a physical or talismanic form, which the potential of that is obviously huge. I mean, it goes beyond just spirit seals, right? It goes into other forms of talisman as well. Like if you want to take a specific quality or virtue, you could potentially make a seal of it like that, like fortitude, for example, using a Mars cameo.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. I think with a lot of that as well, like combining um those methodologies with like whatever evocation of um virtue that you want, it really gets into just creating spirits for tasks.
Mm-hmm.
Like one of the big explorations that I had there that you were mentioning was like, okay, well, I need to get this specific spell done. Let's say passing an exam. Um, I will take this particular, Mercury Kamiya and put all the information relevant to the petition in there, um, create the seal, and then derive the name for it. And then I'm like, okay, this is the angel of passing this exam is now in the room with me. So like, let's do this.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
and usually that would be, mediated and enhanced, and its virtue brought forth through even additional scripture and additional, inclusions in talismanic form. So now that that spirit's there, being like, okay, well, I have your seal. I can either burn this talisman to ash, or I can make it into a powder, and I can empower it in specific ways to include it. And then I'll put all the herbs that enhance the mind, in there, or the burned copies of images of whoever would be proctoring the exam. And just going from there. But really it gets into that territory of like, um how do you make a talisman? It's like, well, that's a pretty good place to start. Make a spirit that their entire reason to be is to accomplish the task.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Gotta hit that numerology.
Mm-hmm. Very true.
Get that
Counting
numerology
numbers.
on.
Yeah, boy.
Mm-hmm. When I said I'm into angel numbers, they didn't think I would just have an angel on speed dial. Like,
Gotta have that Kamiya.
mm,
But even like the seals derived from Kamiyas, right?
yeah.
I mean, why are they so ubiquitous? Why are they so everywhere? I think because they do effectively draw those spirits. And so seals are not, they can be something you receive, just like a name is an oral seal.
Mm-hmm.
If you're privileged to receive one from a spirit. So I think that in general, it's good to know that like, um, the spirit seals, as you were saying, Salt, sometimes like they are a signature of a spirit. Sometimes their very use is a conjuration of that spirit. Like it just calls the spirit by nature of it. And sometimes it requires a particular interaction. I think in Kimanda, puntos riscados are much like this because they require an interaction of breath from the puntos
Mm-hmm.
cantados. So you sing the song to activate the scratched point. The point that is the seal of that spirit. And then we might see that in like vives and voodoo or like mandalas, for example, where like they're created and they're stuffed away and so on. These are meant to be temporary because ultimately you want to clean off the punto at the end to say that like, okay, now we're not allowing a permanent portal to the spirit,
Mm-hmm.
but we are allowing their presence to come forth.
Exactly. Yeah. And like even within then the just to extend it into the talisman making world, like the bones of that spirit become a scaffold onto which other things can be mapped.
Hmm.
So like for these purposes, even in the early example, like in some of those technologies, it's like, okay, well, you have the bones. They've been alive, now they're dead. So let's zhuzh them up, re-enliven them, and go from there.
Yeah. Amazing. This was really fun. I really
Yeah,
appreciate that we all
yeah.
got to share a little bit of our perspectives from these things. And again, this is not to add strict definitions. Even top scholars of amulet studies are not prone to doing that. What we're looking at instead is general uses and virtues and how we, as practicing sorcerers, magicians, carcists, witches, what have you, can better inspire ourselves to take the various charms and talismans in our lives seriously. So, and I will end with one of my favorite recommendations, which is just talk to your spirits and be like, give me a recipe for one. Give me a seal, give
Mhm.
me a set of 3 herbs, give me some instructions. Let me make some that are unique to you and will be even more efficacious precisely because they come from you. Or tell me
Preach.
one that you want me to have.
Mhm.
Tell me one that, oh, it turns out one of my spirits fucking love Nazars, so I have one in a very prominent place on my front door.
Mhm. The what's the talisman that allows me to commune with you better is always one that is recommended.
Legit. Absolutely.
But yeah.
Well, wonderful, guys. Thank you so much. And thank you, Salt, for taking the lead on this episode.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you guys for your expertise and support.
Hell
Mhm.
yeah. That's what we love to hear. Uh, and speaking of loving to hear it, my Akashic record for the day is Loud Bark by Mannequin Pussy. When this album came out, I like lost myself.
Mhm.
10 out of 10 in my opinion. Fantastic. The reason I'm choosing it because it slaps. The other reason I'm choosing it because sometimes you know loud bark and a deep bite, and a good amulet can help you achieve that.
Mhm. Absolutely. My Akashic record for today was going to be Talisman by All Them Witches, but I realized I might have unveiled that one too early. It's already
It
on the playlist.
it was a good one for the Black Plague one
That's
though.
true. That's true.
Hmm.
So, so instead for today's episode, I decided to go with When God Comes Back by All Them Witches, because the god in the talisman is coming back for this one, and the song just fucking slaps.
Fuck yeah, love all them witches.
My all-time faves.
Hmm. And actually, we already mentioned License to Set Apart. It's actually PGM 4, 1227 to 64. Well, specifically the beginning part, which is the exorcism that you use when you're bitch slapping the victim of possession with olive branches, trying to get the diamond out of them.
Mhm.
And then afterwards, once you've done this, you of course hang the beautiful phylactery that is written on a tin metal leaf on top of them
Mhm.
to make sure that they are chill afterwards. But before then, Key, if you would like to give us the recitation while using your olive flog.
Oh, with pleasure. Hail, God of Abraham. Hail, God of Isaac. Hail, God of Jacob. Jesus Christos, the Holy Spirit, Son of the Father, who is above the seven, who is within the seven, being Ayao Sabaoth. May your power issue forth from him, name, until you drive away this unclean daimon, Satan, who is in him. I conjure you, daimon, wherever you are, by this god. Sabar Barabath Ioneth, Sabar Barabathii. Come out to Daimon wherever you are, and stay away from him. Now, now, immediately, immediately. Come out, Daimon, since I bind you with the unbreakable adamantine fetters, I deliver you into the black chaos in perdition.
Okay, so Salt. That one, okay, the guy, the father, he's AJ. Okay. And then the kid on the right, that's Big Justice. And then the little one in the middle is the Rizzler. And the Rizzler is not actually related to them. Okay, so the lore is that they collab together, but the Costco guys are actually originally the father and son duo who are AJ and Big Justice. So which one are you?
I like the name Big Justice, to be honest.
Okay,
It's
okay,
a
that's
good
fair.
name.
Mm,
That's fair. Can I be the Rizzler?
yeah.
I think that makes you AJ.
Yeah, yeah. Because it's like it's the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. It's a whole thing going on here.